P-hacking is very complicated, but it basically means collecting lots of variables and then playing with your data until you find something that counts as statistically significant but is probably meaningless. For example, the website 538 surveyed 54 people and collected over 1,000 variables, and through p-hacking the results, was able to find statistically significant correlations between eating cabbage and having an innie belly button, drinking iced tea and believing Crash didn't deserve to win Best Picture, and eating raw tomatoes and Judaism.
So let's get into it. The emergence of social justice scholarship. These changes may not seem like enough to consider theory a serious departure from postmodernism, but they're a big deal. By dropping the ironic playfulness and meaninglessness of high deconstructive postmodernism, and by becoming goal-oriented, theory went from merely describing the way things are to making prescriptions for how they ought to be. If the truth is only true because we privilege the discourses of straight, white, wealthy Western men, applied theory says this can be challenged by empowering marginalized identity groups and insisting their voices take precedence. This belief amplified identity politics to such an extent that it even led to concepts like research justice. This alarming proposal demands that scholars cite women and minorities in their research and minimize citations of white Western men, because research that values evidenced and reasoned argument is an unfairly privileged cultural construct of white Westerners. Therefore, in this view, it is a moral obligation to share the prestige of academia with other forms of research, including superstition, spiritual beliefs, cultural traditions and beliefs, identity-based experiences, and emotional responses. Since these methods can be applied to virtually anything, a vast body of identity-based fields has emerged since roughly 2010. These fields use their own approaches to epistemology, the ways in which knowledge is produced. There's feminist epistemology, critical race epistemology, post-colonial epistemology, and queer epistemology, along with the broader epistemic justice, epistemic oppression, epistemic exploitation, and epistemic violence. Though apparently diverse, these approaches to other knowledges share the idea that people with different marginalized identities have different knowledges stemming from their shared, embodied, and lived experiences as members of those identity groups, especially of systemic oppression. Such people are seen as disadvantaged because they are forced to operate within a dominant system that is not their own. But they are also seen as enjoying unique advantages because of their familiarity with multiple epistemic systems. Thus, they can alternately be victims of epistemic violence when their knowledge is not included or recognized, or of epistemic exploitation when they are asked to share it. These changes in approach have been steadily eroding the barrier between scholarship and activism. Working from a particular ideological standpoint used to be considered bad in teaching and scholarship. Teachers and scholars were expected to set aside their own biases and beliefs in order to approach subjects as objectively as possible. If they didn't, academics knew that other scholars could and would point out bias or motivated reasoning and counter it with evidence and argument. Teachers could consider themselves successful if their students didn't know their political or ideological positions. This isn't how critical social justice scholarship and education works. Teaching is now supposed to be a political act, and only one type of politics is acceptable: identity politics as defined by critical social justice and theory. Note, the term identity politics is often said to be relevant to the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, but its first usage was in 1977 from a group of radical critical theorists, so it technically means something more specific to the critical theory approach. In subjects ranging from gender studies to English literature, it is now perfectly acceptable to state a theoretical or ideological position and then use it to examine the material without including any evidence or alternative explanations. Now scholars can openly declare themselves to be activists and teach courses that require students to accept the ideological basis of critical social justice as true and produce work that supports it. One particularly infamous 2016 paper titled Women's Studies as Virus, Institutional Feminism, Affect, and the Projection of Danger, even favorably compared women's studies to HIV, Ebola, and SARS, and cancer, advocating that it spread its version of feminism like an immune-suppressing virus, using students turned activists as carriers, calling the metaphor of the virus an ideal feminist pedagogy or approach to teaching. Scholars can, of course, be activists, and activists can be scholars, but combining these two roles can create problems. When a political stance is taught at university, it is likely to become an orthodoxy that can't be questioned. Applied postmodern ideas have escaped the boundaries of the university in ways that the original postmodern theory did not, and they did so at least in part because of their ability to be acted upon. Out in the world, these ideas have gained sway. The postmodern knowledge and political principles are now routinely evoked by activists and increasingly also by corporations, media, public figures, and the general public. Everyday citizens are increasingly confused about what's happened to society and how it happens. They hear complaints about cultural appropriation and laments about the lack of representation of certain identity groups in the arts. They hear demands to decolonize everything from academic curricula to hairstyles to mathematics. They hear that only white people can be racist and that they always are by default. Politicians, actors, and artists pride themselves on being intersectional. Companies flaunt their respect for diversity while firing employees who disagree with progressive politics. Organizations and activist groups of all kinds announce that they are inclusive, but only of people who agree with them. American engineers have been fired from corporations like Google for saying that gender differences exist. And British comedians have been sacked by the BBC for repeating jokes that could be seen as racist by Americans. Applied postmodernism has come into its own, and it's being widely spread by activists. It's now an operational mythology for a wide swath of society, especially on the left. It's very difficult to challenge a dominant orthodoxy. Most people, let alone corporations, organizations, and public figures, aren't radical cultural constructivists. However, because these ideas offer the appearance of deep explanations to complicated problems, they've successfully morphed from obscure academic theories to part of the general wisdom about how the world works. These ideas are so widespread that matters won't improve until we show them for what they are and resist them, ideally by using consistent liberal principles and ethics. Over the next 5 chapters, we'll explain how these applied theories have developed. Then, in Chapter 8, we'll explain how they came to be taken for granted as capital T truth.
All right, that was the last section. I'm reminded a lot of the Jonathan Haidt talk about the university. And is it something that is supposed to discover truth and help us understand the world, or is it something that is supposed to shape and change the world?
I'm going to show you 2 different ways of looking at a university. I'm going to open with 2 quotations from dead white men writing in London in the 1840s. So John Stuart Mill in On Liberty, John Stuart Mill is so wise about human frailties, foibles, biases, the awfulness of our thinking in many cases, and how it is that we need each other to think better, to correct our thinking. So as he wrote, "He who knows only his own side of the case knows little of that. His reasons may be good, and no one may have been able to refute them. But if he is equally unable to refute the reasons on the opposite side, if he does not so much as know what they are, he has no ground for preferring either opinion." Now, think of a university based on Mill's principles, and it's going to clearly be one that strives to represent diverse views. It's going to reach out for viewpoint diversity and encourage a culture of debate and challenge, and only in that way can we find truth together. On the other hand, Karl Marx, writing right around the same time, this is a quote that I've heard a lot, and when I Googled it, what I found, the exact words, they're pretty similar. He wrote, "The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it." Now, You can hear his frustration with the professors, the academics, who will talk endlessly about this or that distinction. And he's saying, no, we need a revolution. We need to change. And so if we imagine a university based on a more Marxist approach to intellectual life, it's going to look extremely different. Now, what kind of university do you want? Do you want one focused on finding truth through debate, or one focused ultimately on changing the world? When I arrived at Yale in 1981, this is what it said over the main gate to the old campus: Lux et Veritas. It's written right there in stone, Veritas, truth. I was inducted into an institution with a long sense of tradition, going back clearly to the medieval universities like Oxford and Cambridge, and going back all the way to Plato's Academy 2,500 years before. It was really thrilling to feel that I was joining a fraternity, especially as a philosophy major. You really feel that link back to the academy and the debates and the symposium and the ways that these early philosophers would argue and in that way improve each other's thinking. But beginning in the 1990s, I believe, universities began to change. What was written over their doorway began to change. And I think they began to adopt change itself as more of the motto, the mantra. And not just any change, not just change for the sake of change, but social justice particularly. Social justice becomes much more important in the life of universities, I believe, in the 1990s. First, of course, from the various studies departments, the gender studies, race studies, all the different ethnic studies departments and areas, but then also the humanities more broadly. Now, let me make clear that many of the changes brought about by these forces in the 1990s were for the good. To the extent that the faculty became diversified, that's all to the good. To the extent that the areas studied, why study just the leaders and the kings and the presidents? Why not study the common people, the people who are oppressed? So to the extent that this was broadening what we study, broadening the people studying, broadening the canon that undergrads read, the books that they read, this is all to the good. I'm very happy about those changes, but I think this set in motion in the 90s, a set of changes that are resonating today and that can help explain what happened last fall all around the country and the very rapid transformation that's occurring this year and last year.
He brings up the quote from Marx about that his point is not so much to understand the world as it is to change it. Yeah. Do we want our universities to have truth as the sign over their door, or as the thing that they are? There's a Greek word, telos. He says, what is the telos of the university? What is the thing that it is?
The telos is like the mission statement. What was it supposed to bring about?
And what is the telos of the university? Is it supposed to be an activist institution, or is it supposed to be a way that we as a society start to understand our world? But then he lays out a very good argument for why you can't have both. You have to decide what you want it to be.
The first is the topic of telos. So telos is a very important word in ancient Greek, very important in the philosophy of Aristotle in particular. The telos is the end, purpose, or goal of an object or a thing. So, the Greeks, they'd sit around and say, well, what is the telos of a knife? The telos of a knife is to cut, and therefore, if this knife does not cut, well, it is not a good knife. So what's the telos of a physician? Well, we can ask that about any profession. What is the telos of a doctor or a scholar or a judge or a lawyer? And I think it's pretty clear. The telos of medicine is health. And if a physician does not bring about health in his patients, then he is no good physician. And if a judge does not deliver justice, then she is no good judge. Now, there are other professions. These here are not closed guilds like the ones on top, but they certainly strive for some sort of a purpose. Business, we might say the purpose of business is profit. Now that I teach in a business school, I have a bit more of a nuanced view that the purpose of business is ultimately to create value, to create some sort of good or service that people need. So you create value. But of course, a businessman who creates value for others and doesn't make any money for him or herself is not a very good business person. So we can speak of that as the telos. And there are many people who join organizations that work for social justice. And I think the telos of social justice, I'm recording it here as racial equality, because that's the most passionate one in this country at this time. But that is meant to include gender equality, LGBT rights, environmental issues, or the whole set of issues that are pursued by social justice activists. Now, these different fields interact. They each have their own excellence, their own expertise, And as they go about their business, they make life better for others. So it's very easy to see this, that business helps us all. You cannot be a doctor, scholar, lawyer, or judge without relying on hundreds or thousands of businesses to do your job. So here are 3 of my favorite companies, because boy, do they save me time. Boy, do they make me a better scholar. I could not imagine doing my work, as I did in grad school without these companies. So these companies help me achieve my telos. And of course, all these other fields return the favor. Obviously, businesses rely on doctors to keep their costs low, on research of all sorts, especially in the sciences, and on justice and lawyers and judges. So each field helps the other to be excellent by using its own excellence. We can say the same thing about social justice. When social justice activists point out that Black and white patients are not treated the same, that maybe Black patients are not recommended as much for an expensive treatment, whatever it is, if doctors are treating people differently based on their category for no good medical reason, it's not just a violation of racial equality, it's also a violation of their telos. They're not healing as well as they could. So social justice activists hold people's feet to the fire, they find discrepancies, they point them out, they help scholars do better work. Here are the areas you're not studying, here's how you've been studying it wrong. So again, each field pursuing its own telos helps others achieve theirs. So that's great, that's constructive interaction. You might just call it the division of labor. And of course, the other fields return the favor and help social justice activists to be effective. But there's another kind of interaction. This is what really concerns me. It happens often that one field injects its telos into another. So I teach a business ethics course at NYU, and a lot of our cases are cases wherever business rubs up against professors, researchers, doctors, lawyers, you know what's going to happen. People get corrupted and they stop pursuing their telos, they start pursuing profit. Doctors increasingly in this country are running businesses, are looking at patients as profit centers, and are thinking, how can I bill for more? Now, this is a direct violation of their telos. This is corruption. The most dramatic case I've seen recently with really historical effects is this one. A couple weeks ago in the New York Times, we learned that you were all raised thinking that fat was bad for you, right? When you were kids, you were told, cut out the fat. Well, that was never true. There was never good evidence for that. The reason why you were taught that is because in the 1960s, there was a trade group, the Sugar Research Foundation. I'm sure they were full of very careful researchers. And they basically bribed or paid, they bought some Harvard scientists to write a review. They didn't just say, here, please write a review. They said, well, here are the studies we want you to review. Now, that is such a violation of the scholar's telos. To do a lit review where you say, you tell me which studies your industry wants to review, we'll write favorably, done, give us the money. That is such corruption. And that led to the government adopting policies saying the food pyramid have lots of starches and only a little bit of fat, which is exactly backwards. Fat isn't bad for you. Fat isn't even fattening. Starches and sugars are what's fattening. They create a big insulin reaction, then you store the fat. But if you eat fat, you get full quickly and you don't eat that much. So fat was never fattening, it was never bad for you. Complete myth, led to an explosion. There were other factors. But this error, this scientific error, is one of the reasons why we had an explosion of obesity in the United States. And it especially affected Black women. Black women's obesity rates shot up more than any other group. So even racial injustice, racial inequalities came about because these 3 scholars betrayed their telos. So that is a destructive interaction. And what I'd like to argue now is that the same thing can happen when social justice injects its telos into other fields. When everybody is thinking about how to improve racial equality rather than their telos, that is corruption. Now, you may not think that it's as bad. It doesn't seem as bad. It seems good compared to profit as your motive. But as I'll show, it can lead to disastrous consequences, especially for the very people you're trying to help.
And I think this section is pointing out how, as a society, we've moved in one particular direction. And it's shaped our academic landscape in a way that went from trying to understand the way things are to prescribing the way things should be. That is that turning point that has gotten us to where we are.
Yeah, and unfortunately, it's moved out into other areas. Even the New York Times came out making statements that they value certain activism. They value trying to make things how they should be over describing what or how they are. And they'll even put moral pressures against not describing things in certain ways if it goes against some sort of activism. And it's moved out into all other different realms, I think, stemming and starting from academia and then moving out into media. But yeah, you can, I have a technically published paper of such assertions. And it was in one of those journals, and it was a paper based on Foucault. And I know that I made the assertion in the thing, I think I told you about it, that Jane Austen's books always start out with something feminist or some sort of concept like that, but then the hegemony gets reinforced by the end of it. And in The Trickster of Seville, the guy starts out as a flirt and a womanizer and all that stuff, but then the hegemony, the Catholic hegemony, gets reinforced by the end of it. And the assertion I was making, which wasn't a new assertion because other people make, is that the ending was just put in there to appease the people so you could sneak out your secret message to the world. And that's what a lot of people believe about Jane Austen, is that the first Act 1 and Act 2 is the message, and Act 3 is just so that the hegemony would let you put the book out. If you've ever watched any of her movies, Pride and Prejudice and all that stuff, and it's always got some feminist type woman who pushes back and bucks against the system until the end. She finally does get married to a guy and falls in line. And they make the argument that no, she was a feminist and the message was the first 2 acts, and the final reinforcement was just her appeasing the hegemony. And you have to just make the bald-faced assertion because you don't really have proof of that. And you make this whole entire paper scrambling around to try to make the proof of some sort of thing. And it's really just an assertion. And there's a million papers like that. And I'm guilty of it myself, but I was just trying to get through a class at that time frame. And then it got published in those journals. And I went and spoke at it. And I remember I was reading all these different quotes by Foucault in it and all that stuff. And I remember going, I don't know what I'm talking about. I was a young kid. And I remember looking out of the crowd at different professors just like with the quotes going. And I don't think they knew either, but they're always like, yes. And it was such a joke of a time frame, but it moves into the concept of everything pushes towards an activism, and it pushes towards reinforcing the message, and it's been a letdown. No how else to say it.
You'll never get those years back.
No.
All right, so let's see. There were some things here that I want to make sure that we have a chance to talk about. I think to start with, the whole thing about capturing the concept of truth is the heart at the core of this thing, because the only reason anything is actionable in any way is that you can lean on some notion of truth to justify your actions. And centering your truth in oppression gives you that power to then interpret the oppression as an actionable item. I think that's why the academy is so important as a target for transforming a society, because we as a society rooted in Western liberal empiricism, see the academy as the place where we root our truth, where we have our best minds digging through the world to figure out what truth is. And so that is a form of power that they want to capture at the first onset.
Yeah. So he mentioned something about representation and how this kind of mindset makes people obsessed with having basically equal representation on boards and things like that. It reminded me of the other day, this dude at work said something about, did you hear that the NFL is requiring by 2024 all to have as many female coaches as male coaches? And I was like, I'm pretty sure that's not true. But I understand like believing that. What?
It's true.
Are you goddamn oh Christ. I really hoped it wasn't.
Yeah, they put out a mandate for it.
But it's stupid. It's just going to be like a figurehead. Anyway, so I put it in, we can watch it if you want. I put a YouTube video in there about the opposite end of it, of requiring representation. It's about like when football was only white and people, it's easier to see on the opposite end of it, on the end that we know is blatantly racist, because it's obviously blatantly racist to exclude Black people from playing football. But this skit actually shows that it not only is it racist, it's stupid, and it destroys the sport. And that's what's going to happen too. If you take a team, like an actual NFL team, and then require half of the people to be white and half of them have to be Black, or half of them have to be male and female, you're not only doing something racist or sexist, you're also absolutely ruining your productivity of your efficiency of that sport.
any endeavor. We can return to that whole telos thing. What is the thing that what is your mission? What is your goal? And any endeavor like this has boundaries. In sports, it may be, famously recently, is it a women's sport or a men's sport? So that defines the boundaries. And then it has, what's the point of it? Is the point competition and excellence and winning on the field, or is the point social justice? And you disrupt all of those things when you insert these quotas and these ideological mandates into what the thing is. So let's take a look at the link you shared. I haven't seen this before.
All right, y'all, settle down. Take your seats. Now, as most of you know, our conference has decided to integrate this season. Settle down. As long as I'm head coach of Chapel Creek, I promise you this will be a white football team.
That's right, because football is a white man's
Football
sport.
is a white man's sport. And let me tell you something. You can print this in your little papers. Week 1, we're going to rain hell down on these black son of bitches. I think we might have taken it too easy on them.
That's it. We took it too easy on them. That was my fault. That was my fault.
Week 2, I'm going to switch up the offense. You thought that was a little run heavy? I agree. We're going to start airing it out on them.
That's right. We coming from the sky this week, boy.
Death from above.
Woo! God damn it. What the fuck's going on?
I don't know what's going on out there. The school board has informed me that we are going to be forced to integrate.
What?
We're going to start the integration process with hiring our first black coach. Coach Johnson's going to be joining our staff.
Well,
Coach Johnson's going to be taking over running the defense for us.
What? Wait a minute. I run the defense.
Now, this does mean we are going to have some black players. We're going to start the white players in the first half, get out a big lead, a commanding lead on them. And we're going to let the black players come in the second half and try to play the game a little bit. Woo! What a comeback. Down 48 in the first half, but goddamn, we came back and won that thing, huh? That's coaching.
Well, next week we do black players first half, white players second half.
All right, I just thought of something. Golly, those white boys almost blew that for us, didn't they?
Hey, I'm sensing a pattern.
I'm sensing a pattern myself. I told you we'd start winning again. Hey. That's a winning streak.
Y'all are gonna have to start making some room in these trophy cases.
Woo! Right. Now, golly, that's good football. That's called winning, Rebel Faithful. I mean, am I fucking crazy, or is this becoming something, you and me?
I mean,
bit of a friendship. I've been going to black church. Shit's fun, man. You can run around, you can dance. Please, Lord, no more whites on the football field.
All right now. All right.
Woo! That's playoffs, baby. We just made the playoffs. We won out and made the playoffs.
Yes, sir, coach. There we go.
Oh, hey, shit! Hey. You see that? Man, I can't believe how racist you guys were earlier. State champions. State champions, number 1. Yep. Some of you doubted. Some of you are still racist. Disgusting. Now, I did use slurs, that is true, but that was forever ago. That was like 8 weeks ago. I am now unity.
Coach, at this time, we'd like to present you with the Martin Luther King Bravery Award for championing diversity in the community.
Thank you so much. Look at this. You guys put this together? I was hoping people were noticing how diverse I was and how interesting I became. I'm number 1. I did it. I'm the most diverse guy ever. This whole shit wouldn't have happened without me. Thank you guys for watching. I'm the best and most diverse dude ever.
Well, we accept growth, coach, and that's...
We do not accept growth anymore. Okay. I was the last one to grow. Now we're done. No more growth. You guys are all racist forever. I'm changed.
Part at the end that's perfect. And it's also fitting because that's Shane Gillis. He's the guy that had a job at Saturday Night Live for a half a day before somebody saw him making a joke about race in an old podcast and got fired. I always use that as this awesome example of how a lot of the things they attack in critical theory is meritocracy. And I use that as football's this great example is meritocracy as an antidote to racism. Because by the end of it, that guy is like, he's a terrible racist at first. And then he's like, wait, never mind. This is a good thing that's happening, this integration.
So Jared, take the sketch. Now we're going to switch it to gender and trans athletes. and we're going to take a university, first trans athlete. Wow, we dominated. Next year, 3 trans athletes. Whoa, we dominated. Because if you think
there's no science that says that, okay? Where's the science that says that a biological male is just going to have an advantage?
Because this is the thing. You can do this. All right, so hold on. I got to find. Okay, so you take the entire population.
Are you doing the
people
bimodal
and you map out where they can perform in something, and you get the bell curve, right? And you got the medium people are in the median, but then you got the high performers. The high performers, they're at the end, okay?
Mm-hmm.
Now, people are arguing about whether or not men are more superior. Athletics doesn't care. Athletics doesn't care about this. Athletics is about this. Okay? Because you want your peak performers. Now, you take 2 populations. In this case, they're showing black and white. And then you look at muscle mass, height, agility, all those different vectors. And you may, as a population, come out with 2 different populations. One is higher than the other. And yeah, for a majority of the population, for any given person, you can't say that one is necessarily going to be more, because one population's higher here, but there's plenty that are lower and vice versa. So you can't say anything. But at the competitive end, it stretches out further. And this is all that matters in athletics. And so what we just saw in that sketch was 2 different bell curves coming together.
Yeah, the bell curve for men and women, they don't intersect for 4 standard deviations. So
yeah, that's the thing, is that the separation between this bell curve, for the most of the part, the separation in that bell curve is not that high. But between men and women, that separation is going to be a lot more dramatic. So the celebrations that we're having about one transgender person, that's only because it's a rare phenomenon right now. But the more prevalent transgenderism becomes, and the more the universities are like, well, we have all these championships. People already complain that, or I don't know if they complain or they just observe that certain sports become dominated by certain racial categories. The people that have won the Boston Marathon tend to be of a certain body type that tends to have some biological component to it. And it's uncomfortable for people to observe that. Bell curves in general are an uncomfortable subject because they speak to populations that people then are tempted to apply to individuals. And it's the same principle of, if you're going to make stereotypical generalizations about black people, that's wrong, because you're stereotyping, you're making judgments about an individual person based on what you believe assumptions about a population are. Is it wrong that you're doing that in principle, or just that you're doing that about black people? Because we see people doing that about white people. All whites are racist, but you're making assumptions about an individual based on your assumptions about a population. And I don't know, I found the sketch hilarious, but also probably prophetic. And how do you see the good in that sketch, but then not apply it to the question of transgendered sports? And the unfortunate reality is, if sports are now dominated by African-American athletes, then what is it in the future? Women's sports are going to be dominated by trans people for the same biological realities.
So that little section mentioned James Damore getting fired from Google. And James Damore was fired from Google, pointing out similar concepts of the same bell curve of when it comes to people who want to become computer programming engineers. He had gone and had to sit through a class of a DEI class explaining to him about oppression and all these different activistic things. And they asked for feedback at the end of it. And he's a little bit of a neurodivergent guy. And he thought when they asked for feedback, they wanted feedback. And so he gave them some feedback. And the feedback was, when it comes to bell curves, if you find, and it's just not even talking about skill, talking about interest. When it comes to interest, if you take 100 people and find the one who's interested in tech stuff, and then make 100 of those one, and then take the one out of those, and then make 100 of those one, and take the one out of those, Google's looking for the top engineers in the world. They're looking for that. And when you boil it down like that across time, what you have is predominantly males. That's just how it falls. That was just how the science of it, the is of the situation. And he was explaining it to them that unless you do certain things to make this appeal more to women, you're going to continuously have this problem. You're not going to undo this problem. And he got fired. And then, strangely enough, Google in a class action lawsuit later that year, when they were getting class action lawsuited because of a gender disparity in wages, they used his exact arguments to try to try to get out of the lawsuit. But we could problematize that same skit in a Derek Bell sort of way. Derek Bell says, we will only ever allow people of color in if there's an interest convergence in it. And because now we're winning or making some sort of capital off of it, that's the only reason we now allow in people of different colors into something. Actually, the mapping the margins, she talks about the Plessy versus Ferguson case, which was a case about a guy, how many drops of blood makes somebody black to be able to ride trains versus other people who, white people and black people, are segregation in trains. But what ultimately got the segregation in trains to get blown away was capitalistic ideas of saying, I don't want to do two different trains, for one for the black people, one for the white people. It's just way more efficient just to do one train. And that's what obliterated it. But just like Jonathan is pointing out, I mean, it gets upside down when you get to the trans situation, because the interest convergence there, if you call it that, or the idea that we're going to do this because it wins, it runs into a situation there. But I also disagree with Derek Bell, because I think a lot of people, it didn't matter if black people won or if we got less train cars or something like that. A lot of white people wanted black people to have the same rights because they believed black people deserved the same rights. It wasn't just interest conversion.
The interest conversion does motivate the assholes, though. So there's that.
Yeah, and it does better. Like you said, the meritocracy does better. It does better on those assholes, like Shane Gillis was playing.
Yeah, I love the end part too. That one of my favorite Bill Maher rants he's ever went on was what he talked about digging up tweets from people from 10 years ago or whatever, and he said, "You're trying to punish us for not being yesterday who we would one day become."
Why is this guy always in the doghouse with the online hall monitors of righteousness? It is a phenomenon that truly fascinates me, that every couple of years, Matt Damon, one of the most likable guys in Hollywood with impeccable liberal credentials, is again flailing around in cancel culture quicksand. It happened again this month when Damon revealed that he used to use a gay slur. I won't say the word. It's not always meant as a slur, but it's wrong, yes, of course. And Damon owned up, saying that while coming of age in Boston in the 70s and 80s, that word was thrown around without any thought put into it. And now he's put some thought into it, and he's going to stop using it. One might say he became woke. Okay, he was late to the party, to which we could say, welcome, glad you could make it. Or we could say, you came later than I did, die. There are too many people in this country who are motivated not by what they really believe, but by what will get Twitter to react to them with likes and retweets. That's called bad faith. It's why every couple of years I'm reading headlines like USA Today, I wish I could cancel Matt Damon. Washington Post, Matt Damon has more Damon-splaining to do. Daily Beast, shut up, Matt Damon. Vox, Matt Damon isn't a terrible person, he's just ignorant. Really? That bad, is he? We're talking about Matt Damon? I don't know, he's got a clean water charity and delivers food to Haiti. What have you done, Vox headline writer? And yet he is always getting pulled over by the woke police for something. He's got a woke rap sheet as long as your arm. On the reboot of the Project Greenlight series, he was booked on obstruction of social justice for maintaining that a director should be chosen on merit first. But merit first is not synonymous with racism. Thinking that it is, that's kind of racist. And now he's done it again by breaking Liam's law. Yes, that's the law that refers to the time a few years back when actor Liam Neeson recounted a story of personal growth involving racist thoughts he had as a young man, but then realizing the error of his ways, expunging the racist element from his anger. But of course, in so doing, he committed the cardinal sin of admitting he was not born perfect and did not emerge from the womb completely enlightened like Buddha. And now Matt's done it with his gay slur admission, committed the crime of not always being the person you would become. You know, I'm so tired of bad faith arguments, and it's all we do now on both sides of our divide.
And that's Shane Gillis's character in that after the credit thing they did was illustrating that, in that, okay, I've done the good thing, now I have to gatekeep, and now he says, we got room for growth. And I like it that they have the white dude who's trying to virtue signal be the one that's just, oh, no more growth. Everyone that was racist is still racist except me. We stopped growing here.
Yeah. And pull the ladder up. But the Shane Gillis, when he got fired from Saturday Night Live, he got fired for making a Chinese accent of like China guy from Chinatown. Saturday Night Live the year before had a white lady doing a Chinese accent.
That's the new standards. Or are you trying to punish them for growing, Chris?
Yeah. It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous trying to keep up with it. I mean, it's a treadmill. You can't keep up with it. And it's partially designed to keep you on that treadmill, to always show that you're the latest version and the latest thing that's no longer sayable or doable, and act like you always knew it.
Yeah. Okay, there's some words here I want to make sure that we have explained. And that is when they get into the idea where identity has to be infused into our discourse in certain ways. He talks about epistemic justice. What is epistemic justice? And this is in a list of epistemic justice, epistemic oppression, epistemic exploitation, and epistemic violence. And they've attached this word derived from epistemology to all these different concepts. And I know you're going to encounter it. And so I want to make sure that the readers understand what these concepts are.
While we might prefer to speak in terms of positive virtues, such as justice, critical theorists find greater utility in speaking of those pressures against which such virtues collide. So you will usually find definitions and explanations of epistemic injustice rather than epistemic justice. The Rutledge Handbook of Epistemic Injustice by Taylor and Francis, published in 2019, defines epistemic injustice as follows. Epistemic injustice refers to those forms of unfair treatment that relate to issues of knowledge, understanding, and participation in communicative practices.
So I think that we could think that there's very broadly at least two forms of epistemic injustice. Distributive notions of epistemic inequality. An incredibly important area of epistemic inequality is the question of whether people have fair access to epistemic goods such as education, information, good advice, technical legal advice, and resources for inquiry of various kinds. That's something which, as I say, I think is an entrenched feature of ordinary social theory and understanding about how injustice and inequality works, but it's worth emphasizing the epistemic aspect of it. It's one thing to know that this group isn't getting their fair share of information or of education, but that's a fairly superficial reading of a phenomenon if discrimination is the source of the problem. There's two kinds of discriminatory epistemic injustice, and we can distinguish testimonial injustice from the hermeneutical. So a brief definition of testimonial injustice. Testimonial injustice happens when, supposing I'm the hearer and there's a speaker, she tells something, perhaps we might imagine it's a female politician. Maybe I'm viewing politicians' views on this, that, and the other and evaluating their authority with respect to what they're talking about. If, perhaps entirely unbeknownst to me, maybe I'm a signed-up feminist with not a sexist belief, but somehow, unbeknownst to me, prejudicial stereotypes of male political gravitas, male political authority are working on my social imagination in a way that leads me, without realizing it, to perceive her as somehow lesser and him as somehow more in their political word. And so testimonial injustices often come about without our intending them to happen at all. What about hermeneutical injustice? Well, again, just to get this on the table for us, this is a slightly more complicated thing to explain. it requires us to also have on the table a notion of hermeneutical marginalization. So, roughly speaking, I had this idea that there's often something unjust about a situation where a member of a certain group has a social experience that he or she just isn't in a position either to understand themselves, or if they understand it well and maybe their social group understands it well, they might yet not be in a position to articulate it properly and communicate it to other powers that be, other social groups, because the concepts required to understand it properly are not sufficiently shared across the social space. Now, that can happen through bad luck. It could be that I have an illness which gives me certain sorts of particular social experiences, for instance, an experience of inability to concentrate, let's say, where it so happens that the medical condition I've got, just through bad luck, is not yet well understood. It's not going to be explained by what I call hermeneutical marginalization, because hermeneutical marginalization is a question of whether people like me get to contribute on an equal enough basis to the stock of shared meanings, to the pool of concepts and interpretive tropes that are at work at large in society. So in a case where it's just bad luck that my illness isn't so well understood at this point in history, so I've got some experiences which are hard for me to understand or hard for me to articulate to others, that in itself isn't going to be a hermeneutical injustice. It's kind of bad luck. What would make it an injustice is if a significant part of the explanation why these concepts are not sufficiently shared across social space is that people like me don't generally get to contribute to the stock of meanings and concepts that are so shared. And so there has to be this aspect of hermeneutical marginalization in the background for a case of unintelligibility, as it were, to count as hermeneutical injustice.
Epistemic justice is going to be, you need to affirm without data, without good evidence, the knowledge principle of a person who is of the oppressed class. That's epistemic justice. It's approve that, just automatically validate the knowledge principle.
Not everything that is true is useful.
They talk about research justice, where you intentionally cite people whose identity is marginalized in the past. So rather than citing the cis hetero white guy who maybe discovered something first, made the groundbreaking articulation of it, if you cite him in your subsequent paper, then you're just upholding the oppressive dominance of the hierarchy, which marginalizes other people who didn't discover it or articulate something. But so you can then cite them. Now,
there's data justice. Have you heard of data justice?
What is data justice?
Do you know what p-hacking is? Like, p-hacking, it's brought up on, if you watch that Elizabeth Holmes movie on Hulu, that they were doing p-hacking with their machines to fake the data to make it look like the machines were always accurate.
Scientists are under constant pressure to publish, with tenure and funding on the line. And to get published, it helps to have results that seem new and striking, because scientists know nobody is publishing a study that says nothing up with acai berries. And to get those results, there are all sorts of ways that, consciously or not, you can tweak your study. You could alter how long it lasts, or make your random sample too small to be reliable, or engage in something that scientists call p-hacking. P-hacking is very complicated, but it basically means collecting lots of variables and then playing with your data until you find something that counts as statistically significant but is probably meaningless. For example, the website 538 surveyed 54 people and collected over 1,000 variables, and through p-hacking the results, was able to find statistically significant correlations between eating cabbage and having an innie belly button, drinking iced tea and believing Crash didn't deserve to win Best Picture, and eating raw tomatoes and Judaism.
And there's been a couple different whistleblowers out of universities who say that they quit their programs, that they were doing psychological studies on people, and they wanted to show something about, homosexuals experience more oppression, and they wanted to reinforce their original concept. And so if they found an outlier that didn't reinforce it, they'd throw out that example. That's p-hacking.
It's just a fancy name for manipulating the data.
Yeah. But data justice will say that you're doing that for a good reason. You're doing that for a reason of activism, or to prove a point, or to show something that's necessary.
I found this paper on data justice. It says the case for data justice
Oh, God.
Let me guess that it's going to start with the assumption of data has always been biased to support the dominant
Foucault.
hegemony anyway. So we're going to simply shape our bias to elevate those things which have been marginalized historically, and that's justified because it's righting prior wrong.
The same way Foucault did history. And yeah. And that's why I'm partially spooked about that, because it's only been several years. And for a while, like even Peterson will mention, when we discovered all these different ideas, like the concept of when the James Damore concept of when options go up, the separation between men and women increases. And that's because of choice. And they have large amounts of data. And he said the people who even originally started seeking that out were liberals, were left-leaning people, but they were of the honest types back in the time, 20, 30 years ago. But with data justice and all that sorts of stuff, I don't know what, even if you are somebody who wants to hold to truth of data, like in the next 10 years, this stuff is becoming so rampant everywhere. I don't know what you're going to be able to trust anywhere on anything.
Epistemic exploitation and epistemic violence are two concepts that they use to show a paradox. Have you encountered epistemic violence before as a concept?
They say just not validating is violence. You know?
So it's so funny that this whole playing with language allows them. Why are they inserting the word violence in here? And I'm sure it has to do with some esoteric definition of the word violence. But let's say you have a conversation, you're talking about a subject, and then somebody comes in with their standpoint epistemology, with their lived experience, and tries to tell you the way things are based on their lived experience. If you tell them that's just one data point, or that's your opinion, it's not backed by any evidence or anything, then you have committed epistemic violence upon them. You've excluded them from the conversation because you're not including their knowledge, their lived experience as a data point in the dialogue, in the discourse.
And any request for proof is academic or epistemic.
Well, and then the contrast to that is then if they bring up something and you say, why don't you explain it to us? Now you're exploiting them. You're extracting their labor. You shouldn't do either. Right. So if you exclude them from the conversation, you're committing violence on them. And if you ask them to be in the conversation and to explain their position, then you're exploiting them.
I've actually been given links to PayPal when I've asked for an explanation. I'm like, well, what do you, like all white people are racist or whatever? I want to say, what do you mean? Or this thing is a racist thing that happened. And I say, what's your proof that it's racist? I'm not going to, don't request my emotional labor of me unless you're willing to pay me. And then people will actually put their PayPal information. They're not going to pay you to lie to me.
Your assumption that they would lie is sign of your epistemic oppression.
I feel like it's a pretty safe assumption.
So they'll say if you're ignorant to whatever their plight is to, that's epistemic violence. But used in the queer theory world, they'll say categorization is violence. So if you make any sort of category idea, which is an epistemic position of trying to make categories, that's violent. You're violently doing that.
Is the use of the word violence just to justify violence as a response?
They say it's silencing. Like if you're questioning, like, oh, what's the truth of that? Is that true? Is that not true? You're silent. You're violently silencing them.
No, I get it. I'm saying like they use the word violence all the time. Like words can be violence. It almost feels, because everybody has part of Western culture is kind of a non-aggression principle type thing, vaguely, that the only time violence is necessary is basically self-defense. So if you start labeling things as violence, then you have your justification for responding with violence.
I don't know if it's intentional, but it's certainly the practical effect of it. And what it does is it reifies and exaggerates the theme of oppression and dominance. If I describe what you did to me as disagreeing with me, then that's not as oppressive as I can say you committed epistemic violence upon me.
Well, it also makes it, if you say you disagreed with me, it implies that you still have to play by the rules. But if you committed a violence against me, it's all bets are off, no holds barred. I can use whatever tactic I want. You could justify using shady, underhanded tactics if what is happening to you is violence or oppression, rather than just disagreement.
And this is probably a facet of what you will find in people defending the recent smacking of Chris Rock by Will Smith, is that the words that Chris Rock used in his joke were a form of violence that then justified Will Smith smacking him.
Somehow white supremacy will be in there.
Yeah.
These concepts come more out of post-colonial theory. I think it's Chakravarty who originated them, Christy Dotson, but it's used everywhere. They all spread, like they keep the same general concepts or ideas if they're useful to the other theories. But yeah, ultimately just listen to us and believe us or it's violence.
Yeah. Well, they caught on to if you use a highfalutin sound word and put it before something with an emotionally charged aspect, then it's a powerful word. So look for epistemic to be put before a whole bunch of an emotionally charged words, and you'll find that it's probably going to be out there somewhere. Or just take some emotionally charged word, domination, and put epistemic before it. Epistemic domination. That sounds like some concept that you could definitely make into a thing.
There's internalized dominance that goes right with it, but I'm sure you could add the epistemic dominance for sure.
Oh, the term identity politics. I remember growing up hearing people toss that around as a negative term. Oh, you're doing identity politics, or you're engaged in identity politics. The left is all infatuated with identity politics and not really understanding what that meant. It's really in my journey through trying to understand the critical social justice movement where identity politics has started to have a very particular flavor that you can identify as you encounter it in the world. And it seems to me it really falls into that theme of where it's eliminated the universal and the individual, and that the individual characteristics of a single person to believe and act and choose according to their own priorities, their own values, is erased. They now have to act as an avatar of a particular identity group, or else they are acting inauthentically. And that we can't see humans in all their different variety as a unified race. We have to maintain the separations and center the differences in them in order to allow people to gain access to the equity that they are entitled to and the way that everything is shaping up here. And that really, in both of those things, it really centers down to identity being so important in how political arguments are made, how political action is done by our society. And it's just so antithetical to the way that I understood that societies evolve and grow closer and closer to a free society where individual autonomy, individual priorities are respected, and that's independent of somebody's identity.
It's identity politics. Just it elevates your group identity characteristics as being your paramount. It's like it's why they try to go back and change the sign from being "I am a man" to "I am a black man," because "I am a man" appeals to the liberal individualist, or how they hate that MLK quote, "The judge a man by the content of his character, not the color of his skin," because the color of the skin is, within identity politics, much more important than him as a person, almost to where it erases him as a person.
Colorblindness is the racial ideology that posits that the best way to end discrimination is by treating individuals as equally as possible without regard to race, culture, or ethnicity. The roots of colorblind racism were largely well-intentioned. It borrows right from the last third of Martin Luther King, which is oft quoted, where he says that he wants people to see his kids for the content of their character, not the color of their skin. And I'm quoting this. So I think it's easy for a lot of well-meaning white folks to hear that and say, well, gosh, okay, yeah, I don't want that to be the primary lens that I use to judge people's character. But colorblindness actually acts to perpetuate racism. So what does color racial blindness look like? Well, it looks like I don't see color. I just see people. We're all just people. I don't care if you're black, white, green, or purple. All lives matter. Those are examples of color blindness. And that is not helpful in terms of becoming a more diverse, equitable, and inclusive community.
Dr. King stated that the arc of the moral universe bends towards justice.
Dr. King is also dead.
Yeah, the term was coined by Bell Hooks. She was one of those black radical feminists from what was it called, the Combahee River Collective. But it's been around so long, it's been around 30 years that, just like Jonathan is saying, it gets, like anything, the meaning gets shifty. It's been applied to a lot of different things, but they originally did talk about it in direct response to the original civil rights movement, of calling into question exactly what you're saying right there, that should we remove identity from this? Can we remove identity from this? No, we unapologetically want to leave identity in there.
Yeah, it's where I think in the moment of the civil rights movement, where there were these legal and institutional codification of racist policies, that you had to acknowledge identity, because this division of society based on identity was the great evil that you were fighting. And the prescription for that, though, was desegregation, integration into society, universal humanity was the ideal that we as a society aspired to. And it's almost like, because that process was not perfect on day one, then we have to throw away the entire enterprise, the entire vision, and double down on identity dividing us. And that's where we're seeing now a return of segregation, segregated teacher groups, segregated student groups. And it just seems like such a backward movement by diving into this identity of politics again.
I think it seems like they don't quite understand the idea that progress in a society being slow is a feature, not so much a flaw. It has to be that way. Like, you can't just go in any direction. That obviously there's directions you want to go, but like legal progress, it has to be slow, because as soon as somebody who's like an asshole gets into power and wants to all of a sudden just push things in there that are evil, he could just do that. And you mentioned it there because you said that if this thing doesn't work out the way I want it to on day one, well, it's not working at all and we should just abandon it.
Yeah. When people say decolonize everything, it seems like, I think our next chapter is going to be post-colonial theory. So we're going to understand what people mean specifically when they say decolonize something. But at this point in the book, I think it's just a way to gauge how far these ideas, what their reach has been in our society. Because you start to see, like you pulled up the article about decolonizing board games. We'll see examples of decolonizing knitting clubs, decolonizing academia, decolonizing video games. So these ideas are making their way into all the different things that we enjoy. And the theme of problematization that we explored previously is going to find their way into all these things too, where if you do enjoy something, guess what? You're going to find all kinds of problems with it now. It was not the thing that you should enjoy because it is so rife with all of these assumptions of dominance and oppression, and you were a bad person for enjoying them. So now you've got to transform it into something that mirrors this ideology, and then you can enjoy it, even if in that transformation it's completely and utterly destroyed. Okay, so this chapter then was just laying the groundwork where we can see that these two entities, critical theory / cultural neo-Marxism and postmodernism, have melded together to create what James Lindsay later calls an operating system. And it's an operating system that can then be applied to many different facets of society. And the next several chapters are going to look at each of those different scholarship realms, whether it's post-colonial theory, queer theory, critical race theory, and see how it is applied. Now, recently, James came out with a video just distilling this concept, how it's an operating system that can be applied to different things. And I want to make sure that we have a chance to look at that before we move on to the meat of the next chapter, which is going to be exploring the world of post-colonialism, what went into that, and how we can see its effect on our discourses today. And so let's take a look at that.
There's a pattern which is developed about how to divide society into oppressors versus oppressed and drive this conflict. And it all started with German philosopher Karl Marx. Now, Marx saw the world through a lens which divided society into those who had wealth and capital and those who did not. The wealthy, or bourgeois, were privileged, and the poor workers, the proletariat, were the oppressed. He had a lot more to say about economics and history and philosophy, but one remarkably effective thing that he did was to lay out a pattern for framing the division between these two groups as the result of existing structures in society.
something we would later call the system. And he provided a narrative that both fueled the resentment and division between the groups and pointed to a revolutionary outlook that sought to overthrow rather than reform existing institutions. Consider it a Marxist conflict paradigm. And here's how it worked. So Marx saw the world through this economic class lens, and that's how he divided society. He came out with a manifesto that described his ideas. The bourgeoisie constructed an idea called economic class. Being bourgeois gave one access to a special type of property called capital or wealth, which was a privilege. The oppressed underclass, which are the proletariat, are excluded from these benefits. The bourgeoisie created an ideology called capitalism to maintain and justify this state of affairs. It permeates and structures society. Now, the structure is essentially those systems of ideas which allow things like private property, individual rights, to hold everything together that's necessary for capitalism. Now, all of this falls under the heading of liberalism. This structure is determinate, which means that your individual identity is irrelevant. Who you are, what you can think, your character, all of this is determined by your position within this structure, which is entirely determined by your economic class. Now, this ideology is mythological. It's essentially a false story that everyone tells themselves because they believe it like a religion. Thus, the oppressor class are made to believe that they deserve the capital and the wealth privilege, while those in the oppressed class are brainwashed to accept it. Those in the underclass, the infrastructure, have no ability to influence society. Only those in the upper class, the superstructure, have this power. The goal of Marxism is to awaken the economic class consciousness in the underclass so that they can agitate for it to also awaken in the bourgeoisie allies, who will become the vanguard in a revolution to overthrow the existing society and to replace it with a system that has no such faults. So you can basically take this narrative that's laid out in the Marxist manifesto and pick out certain aspects of it. So you can think of a way to divide people. The dividing factor in the case of Marx's first analysis, it was economic class. Who were the winners? Well, the wealthy, the bourgeoisie. Who were the losers? The workers, the poor, the proletariat. What gives the winners their status? What's their status marker? Well, it was the privilege that went along with the wealth and capital that they had. What is the ideology that enables this? For Marx, it was capitalism. And what is the system that enables the ideology? Well, we already talked about how things like property rights, contract law, and individual rights were the fuel that's needed in order for capitalism to actually work, and those are all under the umbrella of liberalism. And what do you call your revolutionary philosophy? Well, in Marx's case, it was Marxism. But what this did is it provided a template that subsequent people have used again and again, using different wedges to divide society. But they use the same pattern, and I'll explain how that works. So you can essentially do what is commonly known as a Mad Lib. You start out with a list of descriptors and you fill them in, and then you plug those into a narrative and it gives you your result. So you could take Marx's questions and you can take that pattern where you're going to fill everything in and you just apply it to different ways of dividing society. So the first person that applied this, or the first movement that applied this, was the Neo-Marxists, who were looking at why the Marxist revolutions were not happening in the various countries that Marx predicted them to happen in. They pointed to things like, well, the system of capitalism ended up causing the middle class to flourish and to kind of be happy with their lives, where they didn't sort of want to tear down society and everything enabling the lifestyle that they came to enjoy. And so maybe the problem was that dividing by economic class was not the right way to look at the issues in society. And so Antonio Gramsci and others decided, well, we need to look, instead of economic class, look at cultural class and see how the dynamics play out there. And so they basically just did the same thing. Think of a way to divide people. Okay, cultural class. Who are the winners? The elites. Who are the losers? The lower class. What gives the winners their status? Well, the elites are the ones who want the system that put them in that elite status to stay the same. It's the status quo. It's the status quo that supports their position as elites that they want to keep. What is the ideology that enables this? Well, if you do divide system into a class-based structure and you do have elites and lower classes and you see that as the way that you should look at society, well, this form of classism is the ideology that allows you to feel that way. What is the system that enables the ideology? Well, it's really when those things that shape how culture is seen as being desirable or preferential or the status quo, all of those things are part of the matrix of power in a society. So the ideas that are considered normal, that are conveyed through our educational, legal, family, cultural systems, all the things that are the inputs to the culture of a society, if you get to control those things, then it basically allows you to define what upper class and lower class are, what constitutes norms. And the word that Gramsci came up with for this nebulous thing is hegemony. So it's the hegemonic system that allows the elites to maintain their status quo. And what do you call your revolutionary philosophy? Well, in this case, it was Neo-Marxism. So you can just take these different descriptors that follow the same pattern that Karl Marx laid out in his original conflict theory paradigm, and you just plug it in. Well, it turns out that that's not the only way you can do it. Later people said, hey, this pattern actually works, but we can divide society a different way. One of the most controversial ways this took shape was in the form of what's called critical race theory. What's a way to divide people? Well, race. Who are the winners? The whites. Who are the losers? People of color. What gives winners their status? Well, whiteness. What is the ideology that enables this? Racism. What is the system that enables the ideology? Systemic racism. And what do you call your revolutionary philosophy? Critical race theory. So let's just plug and play. Well, it doesn't stop there, because you can also divide society by gender, and you can apply the same format. What's a way to divide people? By gender. Who are the winners? Men. Who are the losers? Women. What gives winners their status? Maleness. What's the ideology that enables this? Well, it's the patriarchy. What is the system that enables this? Well, it's systemic patriarchy or systemic sexism. And what do you call this revolutionary philosophy? Marxist feminism. Same thing, just plug and play. Then things start to get a little bit more complicated, because people figured out that you can not only divide people by those very tangible things, but you can even go meta a little bit and divide by the different ways that society interacts with itself. This is most conspicuous in something called queer theory, where you take whether or not something is considered and accepted as normal, and some people aren't quite normal. And so that sense of normality is a way to divide society. And so you can just take a look at the paradigm that they use there. Think of a way to divide people. The dividing factor is normality. Who are the winners? Well, if you're a cis, heteronormal kind of person, then you're the winner. And if you're not that, then you're different. You're on the margins, particularly on the issue of sexuality and gender. If you just don't fit any of the normal boxes, then you're queer. And you're a loser in the way that this conflict is set up in order to drive the activism. What gives winners their status? What's the status marker? It's acceptance in society, being considered normal and acceptable. What is the ideology that enables this? Well, it's cis-heteronormativity. What is the system that enables the ideology? Well, it's systemic cis-heteronormativity. And what do you call your revolutionary philosophy? You call it queer theory. So now, rather than dividing by race, gender, or anything, you just divide by what society thinks normality is. So when you see people blowing apart what appears normal and pointing to things that are accepted as normal as a form of oppression, whether that is being able to call men men according to traditional definitions and women women according to traditional definitions, well, those act of defining what constitutes a normal man and a normal woman are seen as a form of oppression. And it's all through this lens of how to describe and work with conflict that was originally mapped out by Karl Marx. All right, well, this goes into even more unusual and discomforting corners when you look at ability or health. So there's an academic field that looks at disability and says, well, we can divide society into those who are able and those who are disabled. So who are the winners? Well, the abled. Who are the losers? The disabled, the crippled.
What gives winners their status? Well, their ability, their health. What is the ideology that enables this? It's a form of ableism, where some preference or priority is given to people who have ability. What is the system that enables this ideology? It's medicalism. It's using terms derived from medicine to define things and people that are diseased and those that are not diseased, and attaching some sort of qualitative value to that. If you're disabled, then somehow you're lesser than those who are able, and that is a form of medicalism. Well, what do you call your revolutionary philosophy? It's crip theory. So you can do the same thing. You can see how this paradigm, again, maps out. Finally, you can look at even something like how big a person is has been used in the same way to divide people. So how do you divide people? Well, whether they're fat, whether they're thin. Who are the winners? The thin. Who are the losers? The fat. What gives winners their status? Well, they have the ideal weight, or they are thin. What is an ideology that enables this? Weightism or fat phobia. And what's the system that enables this ideology? Again, it's medicalism. The idea that medical science can label who the preferred body shape is and use its terms of health to do that. People who adopt this philosophy see that as a form of medicalism. It's a form of injustice, and it's the thing that fuels this whole system. And so you can just call this way of looking at the world fat studies, plug it into the Marxist conflict paradigm, and you have your fat studies manifesto. So just to give you an example of how you could take any difference that exists within a population and just plug and play this in, and it works, you could take the idea of passing. Now, in the trans community, there are some trans people who, after they've transitioned to a different gender, have more or less success in looking and passing as their transitioned gender.
Some trans people are luckier than others. Some trans women are able to go to the grocery store and pick up their dry cleaning without anyone knowing that they're trans. Some trans men are able to get a haircut, go to the movies, and go shopping at the mall without anyone knowing that they're trans either. In the trans community, we call that passing.
And the ones who get accepted or maybe are not detected as trans individuals are described as having a form of passing privilege that those who don't have the benefit of immediately being accepted as their transitioned gender possess. And so you could take the fact that this divides the community of trans people and you could plug and play it. So let's do it. Think of a way to divide people. Well, whether or not you pass. Who are the winners? Those who pass. Who are the losers? Non-passing people. What gives the winners their status? Well, if they get accepted, then they get access to all the privileges that go along with that acceptance. What is the ideology that enables this? We'll just call it passism. The idea that, it's right for people who are able to pass to get that privilege. What is the system that enables this ideology? Well, systemic passism. All those aspects of society which place value on whether or not you can pass, which fuel the benefits that somebody could get for actually passing. All of these exist invisibly in a society to fuel the effects of passing privilege. What do you call your revolutionary philosophy? We'll call it critical passing theory, and we'll just plug and play it.
When trans people pass, we are able to exist in the world without people necessarily knowing that we're trans. Passing comes with all sorts of privileges. When you pass, when you don't look trans, it can be easier to find a job, easier to find a partner, and easier to be accepted by the world around you. Passing also helps trans people avoid violence and harassment. The messed up reality is that when people can't tell that you're trans from looking at you, you're often safer. Passing is a problem.
So you could probably look at this and say, wait a second, the people who passed didn't get together and call a meeting and say, we're going to create an idea called passing. Well, the thing is, if you go back and you look at all the different lenses that we looked at before, the capitalists didn't get together and construct an idea called capitalism. It was something that evolved out of the natural processes of economic exchange. In terms of all those different ways that we've divided society and provided this narrative, the narrative is making assertions that don't accurately reflect the historical reality in all of its complexities. But it works for the purpose of fueling the resentment by driving this wedge between people so that you can push for activism and revolution.
Rather than asking trans people to pass, we need to redefine the way that we understand women, men, and people in general. There's no right way to look like a woman. There's no right way to look like a man. And for us non-binary trans folks, you shouldn't have to look like a man or like a woman in order to be treated well by those in your community.
And you could see how adopting this philosophy, if you're in the trans community, will cause people who do have a greater degree of passing to be resented by those who do not. And it'll create internal strife and conflict within the community because people who have that passing privilege will be considered to be taking benefits that could otherwise be distributed to those who don't have the passing privilege in a way that is unfair, in exactly the same way that property and any of the other paradigms of this Marxist conflict theory fuel this stuff. So now we get to kind of the one ring to rule them all in terms of applying Marxist conflict theory. Because you could kind of say that while we've looked at different wedges to divide people using this Marxist conflict paradigm, several people started to realize that the more oppression identity markers that an individual had, then you could say that the greater degree of oppression that they had. And if your analysis of society didn't take this into account, then it was another form of oppression. And this is where we get the concept of intersectional oppression or intersectionality, first brought to the forefront by Kimberly Crenshaw. So, how do you apply this same pattern? Well, what's a way to divide people? Well, univariate oppression. People who only have one marker of oppression versus people who have multiple markers of oppression. Who are the winners? Well, the privileged oppressed. Those people who have very few markers of oppression. Who are the losers? The intersectionally oppressed, those people who have multiple markers of oppression. So if you compare, for example, in the feminist movement, if you have black and white women together working for feminist equality, well, the white women are probably only working for equality between the genders, whereas the black women are not only having to contend with sexism in their fight for equality, but also racism. And if the fight that the women are fighting, who are white, does not include the racist dimension, well, now we've got white women who are essentially oppressing the black women because they're not actually working towards full, complete liberation of the black women because they're not taking into account their intersectional oppression. So, what gives the winners their status? Well, relative privilege. Those who only have a few markers of oppression are privileged relative to those who have multiple. What is the ideology that enables this? Univariate analysis. If you're only looking at the world through one axis of oppression, then you are enabling erasure of the realities of intersectional oppression. What is the system that enables this ideology? Well, it's systemic oppression, the fact that oppression does exist through all these different axes. But how you perform your analysis and the way that you shape policy and procedures, if you're only looking at that univariate axis of oppression, you're going to miss people. What do you call your revolutionary philosophy? Well, you can call it intersectionality, and you can just plug it and play into the same Marxist paradigm. Now, it gets complicated. It gets harder to map this narrative out when you start getting so ethereal and ephemeral as this intersectionality perspective carries, but there's something to keep in mind, and that is that this intersectionality does something within the realm of those activists who adopt it in the first place. And that is when they become awakened to this intersectional consciousness, then they have to do something about it. They have to make sure that their activism incorporates this intersectional view into it. And what that means is that you now have to take into account every variable of oppression and every oppression marker that any individual has, and you have to order how you perform your activism.
In New York, they use something called a progressive stack, which means if you have your name on a list and you come from a traditionally marginalized background, race, gender, ethnicity, anything that is traditionally marginalized, you get bumped up the list. So this means we want to be able to hear what everyone has to say. Also, one of the things stressed at Occupy Wall Street is the step up, step back. This means people who have been privileged all their lives, mainly white men, white women even, people who have been privileged, need to realize that they need to step up and step back if they've already said what they had to say.
Isn't this supposed to be an egalitarian movement? kind of sort of. That's why you're ready to have no matter who they come from.
Yeah, I think it doesn't matter whether what their general background is, because the majority of us are already part of the marginalized class of people. So it wouldn't matter, because more people who are under that marginalized group would get to speak anyways. And I think what?
All right, something we need to identify off the bat. When we talk about privilege, we're talking about access to institutional power. Okay, the things that come from your skin color, your sex, your class. Okay, and these are things you need to be aware of. That you have privilege over other people at different levels, or you may have less privilege than other people, depending on who you are. Yes, we may all be marginalized, but some of us are far more marginalized than others. And we need to be respectful of that. Okay.
And people have started to realize that this basically means that it foregrounds people who have multiple markers of oppression and marginalizes people who might only claim one axis of oppression. And so, whereas in the past, before you completely accept this intersectional view of dividing people and trying to rectify that division, you might have a white gay activist who is a man who is very effective at messaging, very effective at activism. But if he's now incorporating this concept of intersectional oppression, anyone who can claim more oppression markers should be centered and elevated because of those markers of oppression. And so ultimately, you're going to end up with people who are on the margin of all the various different axes of oppression. So if you have a white gay man trying to make an argument or implement a procedure and his opponent is a disabled trans woman of color, well, then you're going to give priority to the disabled trans woman of color because they rank higher on the progressive stack of intersectional oppression. And so they should be given centrality, acceptance, promotion, everything above someone who has fewer markers of oppression, because those fewer markers of oppression are a form of privilege.
If you are part of the LGBTQIA community, you need to share this. And if you're an ally, step up. Body shaming of any sort is not okay. I am a thicker man, and that is okay. All you gay boys out there who shame other men for how they look, ew. And let's not forget, not dating someone because of their skin color isn't preference, it's racism. Let's not forget ableism, biphobia, transphobia, and ageism. This LGBTQI community needs a serious check, especially the gay men. And just because someone is non-binary, non-conforming, and gender fluid doesn't mean they're trying to change their gender or anything. They're just not going to fit into society's norm of what a man looked like and what a woman looks like, because it's all actually made up from some Christian Bible that was made by a white man to suppress a bunch of slaves. Same with grammar. Stop the hate or get off my page.
The most powerful point he makes is if you base your entire worldview on this, then when the next thing comes around that problematizes you, using that same framework, you have no way to fight against it because you based your entire position on the same framework.
People have been hinting at, they've been trying to say it for years. It's this fill in the blank studies, this fill in the blank studies, this fill in the blank studies. And people have these ideas in their head that they're all some crazy different theory that you need to spend your entire life in each different one. And it's all just cut and paste.
Yeah. The question is, how do you push back against it? How do you undo that Gordian knot or whatever? And they make the case. You have to understand and respond with moral, ethical, liberal principles and values. But
yeah,
I think our generation has gotten to the point where they don't even know what those are.
Then you have other people like Bogosian and they're trying to make that new university down in Austin, Texas. But there's people who are just, there's some people, Peterson just resigning. They're saying it's just lost. It's lost.
Yeah.
Like you gotta just restart something else. Because
wait, Peterson resigned from that effort?
Peterson resigned from the University of Toronto, and he said,
yeah.
Main reasons he's doing it is because there's certain types of things like you can't, Gad Sad's talked about it a whole lot. You can't even go try to do any sort of scientific study without having some sort of proof of a critical justice aim to it, or having some sort of proof of, just like the football thing, you have to have a certain amount of people on your staff or in your group who are of a different race or something like that.
Yep.
And so you can't even get into any sort of study without just this board of people. And that's probably a little worse in Canada, but it's pretty bad here. But you cannot do anything without buying into the stuff.
Yeah. And we're going to see how that works, because as much as this stuff has a huge footprint in the world of culture, in the world of Hollywood, in the world of everything, the number of people that actually buy into it as a whole, the whole demographics of America, all the breadbasket America, normal people, the silent majority, they don't buy into it. But then when the culture that they're consuming is saturated with it, they're just going to not do it. And so that's where you get the successes and failures that maybe if Hollywood people or and academics are scratching their head. Is it Spider-Man was so successful because we didn't inject all this social justice crap into it and it was just a good story? Whereas this other story that is infused with social justice crap bombed. And so that's another instance where the market may actually maybe soften the edges of the ideological extremism. But
maybe, but now you have different capital funders from the top that don't care about money in the same way that we used to, because those things get themselves into MMT or Marxist type theories, and they get money from different proofs of falling in line to ideologies. But there's the second level with the average person in America who might not agree with this stuff, but they're still operating off of the long goodwill that we got from our universities and from our scientific studies. And they're still assuming those universities are just doing hard, rigorous work everywhere. And it's just no matter what or where it is or what department it's in. And part of what's difficult to explain to them is that, no, these studies are everywhere. They're in everything. And this is what they do. And this is how they act. And this is really what they believe. And they push into everything. And so far they haven't won in STEM, but they're pushing, they're active.
Oh no, I think COVID has shown us the emperor's clothes in STEM, in the medicine anyway. And people are seeing that and they're losing their trust in the institutions that we should be trusting. And it's not necessarily revealed in any single moment in time, but it's revealed in the reversals and in the things that you used to get banned from social media for saying that now are accepted as undeniable scientific fact. And it's just, it's a weird world where, regardless of whether or not you agree with the knowledge principle, if you have completely corrupted all of your knowledge-making institutions so that you can't tell whether a particular paper is ideologically distorted or not, then you may as well not be able to determine what's true.
Yesterday's conspiracy theory is today's it was always true.
Yeah. All right, guys. I think we can wrap it up there unless there's any other last things you want to add.
Nope. All righty.
All right, take care.
Way to go.